Shutter speed, along with aperture, contributes to the exposure of an image, but also controls motion blur. The shutter is a mechanical curtain that covers the camera sensor. The longer the shutter is open, the more time the camera sensor is exposing the image, making it brighter. A faster shutter speed results in less light getting through, and the sensor exposing the image for less time, making it darker. The unique thing that shutter speed controls is the way a camera captures motion. When the shutter is open for longer, moving subjects will become blurred in the final image. The less time the shutter is open, the less motion blur you will get with moving objects. Because we're shooting video on digital cameras and not pictures for this course, I want to explain how shutter speed works on traditional film cameras and some high-end digital cinema cameras. A side note, our DSLR and mirrorless camera shutters do not work this way. They implement an electronic shutter which powers the camera sensor on and off. If I record video on my Sony, you can see nothing is happening mechanically with shutter speed. It's all electronic. You can't see it. But to understand shutter speed better for video, let's dive into how they shot film before digital was a thing. In motion picture cameras, the shutter mechanism is called a rotary disc shutter. It looks like this. The way they work is by spinning in front of a film camera's film gate, exposing the film based on the angle of the shutter. As the film moves past the film gate, the shutter spins, allowing a certain amount of light through for each frame of film. The shutter can operate at different angles. The wider the angle, the more motion blur. The smaller the angle, the less motion blur. This is because with a wider angle, the film is being exposed to light and motion for a longer period of time. A shorter angle equals shorter exposure time. Film would typically shoot at a shutter angle of 180 degrees. And now, since we are used to that type of motion, it looks the most natural to us. Or in other words, if you want your videos to look like film, shoot at a 180-degree shutter angle. On any project I work on, I will mostly follow this rule of filming at a 180-degree shutter angle. With most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, the shutter speed is recorded in fractions of seconds. If I want to replicate filmic motion blur or get a 180-degree shutter angle on a digital camera, the rule is to set your shutter speed to double the frame rate. There's also these nifty shutter angle to shutter speed calculators that convert for you. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second and I want filmic motion blur at a 180-degree shutter, I would set my shutter speed to 1/48th of a second. Okay, but my camera doesn't do 1/48th of a second. Okay, well then you set it to 1/50th of a second, which is the closest option to doubling your frame rate. If you wanted to shoot at 30 frames per second, follow the doubling rule and set your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. Say you want to shoot at 60 frames per second, then set it at, yes, you've guessed it, 1/120th of a second. I typically film everything at 180-degree shutter angle. However, you don't always need to follow these rules, but just remember that they will give you results that will feel the most cinematic. So to recap this lesson, the shutter speed is another tool for exposing an image. The longer the shutter is open, the more light comes in, and the greater the motion blur. The shorter the shutter is open, the less light comes in and less motion blur is captured. I recommend you stick to the shutter rule of your shutter being twice the amount of your frame rate so that you get cinematic motion blur. In the next lesson, we will look at practical applications for shutter speed.